All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into the central argument of historian Rashid Khalidi's really influential book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. We're going to unpack the one powerful idea that he uses to reframe an entire century of history.
So, right at its heart, this book throws down a pretty big challenge to the way we usually hear this story told. Is this a super complex two-sided conflict, between different peoples and religions? Or, as Khalidi suggests, is that completely the wrong way to be looking at it?
And there it is. That's the core thesis, right there on the screen. To make sense of the last 100 years, Khalidi argues that you have to see it not as a war between two equal opponents, but as a colonial project. And that one single idea, well, it changes everything that follows.
So, to really get a handle on the historical evidence the book lays out, we first need to understand the main concept that holds his entire argument together.
This is the key term, settler colonialism. Now, in this view, the goal isn't just for an outside power to come in and rule over the people who are already there. No, the goal is to replace them, to literally build a whole new state and society right on top of the old one.
So this really is the fundamental clash in how you see things. Common narratives tend to frame this as a symmetrical conflict, or maybe a religious war between two sides with equal footing. But Khalidi completely rejects that. He argues we're actually watching a totally different kind of historical event unfold. Okay, so how does the book actually build this case? Well, Khalidi structures his whole argument around 6 key moments in history. And he calls them declarations of war, not in a legal sense, but as these critical turning points that he says pushed this colonial project forward.
So the book's argument stretches across an entire century. It connects these 6 major events, from the Balfour Declaration way back in World War I, through the Nakba in 48, the wars in 67 and 82, and all the way up to the Oslo Accords and the conflicts of the 2000s. Khalidi's point is that these aren't just separate crises. They're all connected chapters in one long story.
The story kicks off in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. Khalidi presents this as the first foundational act of colonization. In it, Great Britain promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, but it did so while talking about the indigenous Arab majority, who were over 90% of the population at the time, in a way that basically ignored their political rights. The second declaration of war, according to the book, hits in 1948. So the UN comes up with this plan to partition the land, the State of Israel is established, and for Palestinians, this event becomes known as the Nakba, which means catastrophe. The book argues this was the deliberate and violent expulsion of most of the Arab population. And to really wrap your head around the scale of what Palestinians call the Nakba, the book zeroes in on this figure, over 750,000. That's how many Palestinians were either expelled from their homes or fled. Khalidi argues this was no accident, not some unfortunate byproduct of war. He says it was a necessary act of mass displacement, calling it a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing.
The third pillar of this argument is the 1967 Six-Day War. From Khalidi's point of view, this was much more than just a defensive war. It ended with Israel occupying the rest of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And this, he says, locked in direct military rule and just crushed the hopes for Palestinian self-determination.
Next, the book looks at the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. The stated goal was to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. But Khalidi focuses on this war not just because of the devastation, but because of what it showed about outside support. He marks this as the moment when U.S. military and diplomatic backing for Israel became, in his analysis, pretty much unconditional.
Now, this next one is maybe the most counterintuitive point in the whole book. The Oslo Accords, the ones celebrated around the world as this breakthrough for peace, Khalidi frames them as the fifth declaration of war. He argues they were a kind of trap, creating a Palestinian authority with no real power, all while providing diplomatic cover for Israel to speed up settlement building.
The sixth and final phase takes us right into the 21st century. This covers the Second Intifada, multiple wars on Gaza, and a crushing siege. In the book's telling, this is just a modern version of the same war, one that combines overwhelming military force with diplomatic moves that are all designed to finalize Palestinian dispossession.
So you see these 6 events, but they aren't just a grim timeline. The book argues they are all deeply connected.
Khalidi pulls out several themes that he says run through all of them, tying it all together into one single, coherent story.
There are three main threads here. First, the book carefully documents how support from Western powers, especially Britain early on and later the US, was absolutely essential at every single stage. Second, it really emphasizes that Palestinians were never just passive bystanders, highlighting a full century of resistance. And third, Khalidi makes it personal, using his own family's history and archives to tell the story from the inside out.
So after going through this whole framework in these 6 declarations, you kind of have to ask, what's the point? Why does it even matter to see this history through Khalidi's lens? What's the significance of this reframe?
Well, its main impact is how it goes right up against the stories a lot of us have been told. The book pushes back on ideas like an ancient clash of civilizations or some kind of intractable religious war. Instead, it insists on seeing this as a modern political conflict, one that's rooted in the very specific history of colonialism. Ultimately, the book's whole purpose is to shift our perspective. It asks us to stop seeing these events as a conflict between two sides and instead see them as a story of colonial dispossession. And when you do that, it also reframes Palestinians, not as passive victims, not as just obstacles, but as people who have been actively fighting for their own self-determination for 100 years.
And that really leaves us with this final question. The book makes the case that the frame we use to understand a story, the very language we use, it determines what we notice, what we see as just, and what we imagine is even possible. So, how does changing that frame change everything?